So what's really the purpose of writing a proof? Suppose you've got some mathematical assertion and you're more or less convinced that it's true, it feels true, so why would you write a proof? Well, you could say it's, on the one hand, just to gain certainty of its truth. Sometimes things feel true, and you end up pursuing a proof, and this has happened to me many times. I feel like something is true, then I try to prove it, and I get stuck. And I stay stuck for a while, and eventually I realize that the reason I'm stuck is that it's not really true after all. There were some cases that I missed, there's some detail that I didn't think about, or there's something, this happens less often, but it's very cool when it happens. There's something deep there that I missed. And from that experience, I will really learn something. That's basically learning, right? Is correcting your own beliefs. So that's one way to think about the purpose of a proof, is to gain certainty about your assertions, or at least to gain certainty that there is a way to follow the deductive rules to go from from the axioms to whatever it is you seem to believe at the moment. Okay, but there's another purpose for proofs. It's not just certainty. Proofs are also a form of communication. So the goal when you're writing a proof is to write it for someone else, for others, to not only convince yourself that something is true, but to write it in such a way that it convinces others. I mean, usually those go hand in hand, right? If you've written something that you don't think convinces others, then it probably shouldn't convince you anyway. But if you're trying to convince others, then it matters how efficiently you communicate. So a lot of this course is going to be focused on communication, and specifically precise communication of mathematical ideas. So two of the goals that I'm describing, certainty and communication, efficient communication. Sometimes these two goals are at odds with each other when you are writing proofs. So you kind of have a trade-off to worry about. Yeah, I don't know how to represent that. Maybe a balance beam or something. So there's kind of a trade-off. If you write a formal proof, if you write a list of propositions that starts from the axioms and goes perfectly deductively to every along the way to whatever it is you're trying to prove, then you can gain certainty. But this will usually be very ugly. And if you look at the reading for this for today, you'll see an example of how symbolic and not immediately humanly readable it will look when you just have a pure formal proof. So there you have certainty, but not very much efficient communication. If you were to give it to someone else, so maybe you have checked every line. If you were to give it to someone else, then they have to check every single line and do all that work to verify that your proof is correct. Usually there's a more efficient way, which is rather than telling them exactly every step and making someone check every step, you tell them how they would construct their own proof, their own formal proof like yours. So instead you tell sort of a story, usually in English, using, or whatever your language is. Using natural human language, you tell a story that describes sort of how one would go about building a formal proof. And if the instructions in your story work and can produce a formal proof. If your opponent or whoever you're trying to convince can carry out the instructions and it works, then they'll be convinced. But as you go along, people sort of don't really write down the formal proofs. They just pass along these stories, and I'm going to refer to these stories as informal proofs. Which is initially a kind of misleading term because it sounds like it's saying sloppy or bad proofs. That's not really what I'm referring to. I'm referring to sort of the difference between what we were looking at earlier, like this list of propositions, this, where each is deduced from the previous. This is a formal proof. An informal proof is more like, rather than the actual proof, the actual list of propositions, it provides instructions for generating a proof. And it's much more human readable, and you end up with much more efficient communication. Now, again, this is a trade-off. If you go too far, if you give too vague of instructions or too broad, if you make your strokes kind of too broad, then you lose out on the certainty that that the instructions can actually be carried out effectively to produce a proper formal proof. So often when you're writing proofs, you need to choose the right level to write your proof at. Early on, when you initially define some new concepts and you initially lay out some theorems and you're not really sure what's going to end up working out, you tend to favor certainty over efficiency of communication. So early on, you tend to favor certainty. You show every step. You try to really work out all of the details. Then over time, as you become used to certain patterns of proof and see a lot of patterns repeating themselves, you can take advantage of those to broaden your strokes and make your communication more efficient. And if you play that game slowly and carefully, then you can gain efficiency in communication without losing so much certainty in the correctness of your proofs.